This week, we'll be exploring unsolved mysteries that range from one of the most highly documented and reliable UFO encounters ever, to the world's first stop-motion film, to the case of the missing $400,000 diamond that went missing during a Formula One Grand Prix. We will explore all of these and more, so grab a drink. My choice today is pumpkin spice coffee with cream, which is absolutely delicious, by the way, and very seasonal. And join me as we explore the unsolved mystery Iceberg. The Falcon Lake incident. Now, this is honestly one of my favorite alien/UFO encounters ever, depending on what you believe about it, which will all make sense in a little bit. So, Stefan Michalak was an industrial engineer based in Texas, and he often liked to head out into the wilderness around Falcon Lake to do stuff like prospecting and digging for quartz and silver and stuff like that. He was kind of an amateur miner or geologist, if you will, and this activity was more or less a hobby for him, connecting to the wilderness, maybe finding a cool rock or something. Every guy's dream. So in May of 1967, he's out here in the wilderness all alone near some quartz, I suppose, when he was suddenly startled by some geese. Now, as scary as geese are, for sure, they are not aliens. Or are they? I mean, that sounds like a conspiracy theory entry that I would love to get into, but not today. When he was startled, he looked up, the geese around him flew away, and he saw two cigar-shaped objects, glowing red, hovering about 45 meters away from him. One landed on a rock, and the other just kind of hovered nearby and then flew away. And Stefan assumed that these were just experimental US military crafts. So he sat back for a while and actually sketched them. After about half an hour, I guess curiosity got the best of him, and he decided to approach the craft that was still there. He felt a warmth around the crafts, a smell of sulfur, and as he got closer, he could hear the sounds of motors and the hissing of air. He saw a door open on the side of the craft, and when it opened, he saw these bright lights coming from inside of it, and said he could hear voices, but couldn't understand what they were saying. At this point, he shouted out, asking if the Yankee boys needed any help. Yankee boys meaning just because they were American, and Stefan was Polish-American. And if these were military crafts, they were most likely US military crafts, and so they were probably American. But as soon as he shouted this out, the muffled voices that he was hearing went completely silent. He tried asking again if they needed any help in Polish, in Russian, in German, but there was no response. So he moved closer and actually reached out a hand and touched the craft, and he felt that it was very, very hot, and the outside was built of a smooth metal all the way around, apparently, with no visible seams or joints on it. As he got closer to the craft, the lights inside just got brighter and brighter, eventually forcing him to wear his welding goggles that he normally used when he was mining. He peeked inside and saw bright lights and panels, but no sign of life, humans or otherwise. So, a little hesitant, he stepped back, and as soon as he did, the opening or door on the side of the craft slid shut. The craft then got louder and louder with the mechanical sounds, and he reached out a hand to touch the craft, and at this point, it burnt through his glove. Then the craft began to spin round and slowly take off. Now, as he stood there watching the craft slowly take off, he noticed on the side of the craft a grid of holes of some kind. Maybe it was an outlet, maybe it was a vent or something. And just as the craft was taken off, Stefan was blasted in the chest by hot air or gas or something coming out of the grid. This blast was so powerful that it knocked him back onto his feet and set his shirt and hat on fire. The craft continued to whir around and take off into the sky, and Stefan just ripped off his burning clothes and stumbled back through the forest to the motel that he was staying at, all the while disoriented, nauseated, and vomiting. He was eventually taken to hospital for the burns on his chest and stomach, which by this point had turned into raised up sores on his chest, in the actual grid pattern of the craft's vent, which looks kind of cool but kind of horrible at the same time. And for weeks after, he suffered from diarrhea, blackout, blackouts, headaches, and weight loss. So what the hell were these crafts? And what really happened to Stefan that night? That's a good question. Well, for years after the incident, there was all sorts of attention and attraction on the family. There were visits to their home from police, the Air Force, the media, multiple government agencies, and just random members of the public that either wanted a photograph, an interview, a signature, or just some questions answered, I guess. But this attention on the family got really tiring really quickly. It even got to the point where there were multiple letters, phone calls, people camping out on their front lawn, and a little scarily, people following Stefan's son to school and asking him about the encounter. I mean, these people probably need hobbies if they have enough spare time to follow children to school and basically interrogate them. I don't know, maybe take up crocheting or something. And Stefan eventually said that he believed that he should never have even spoken a word about this. But at the time of the incident, he said he wasn't really thinking about that. He felt that it was the right thing to do, it was the truthful thing to do, and that he needed to make everyone aware of this craft, so that if someone else was in the woods or wilderness like he was, and they encountered the craft, that they wouldn't walk up to it and get injured as he did. He was just being the kind, moral citizen. Stefan's son, Stan, was bullied in school for this, with Stefan himself being called crazy by many people, especially local people, but he never backed down from his story and never once changed it. He also never believed that this was an alien craft. He said that in his opinion there was no evidence for that, and he was a very logical and practical man, not believing things that he didn't have evidence for. He always considered this encounter and the crafts to be secret US military crafts, which I guess a UFO technically is. It's just an unidentified object that flies, so there's no aliens that are technically necessary. This UFO encounter even beats the Roswell encounter for myself and many others, as the Roswell encounter is still very shrouded in mystery, and the US government still to this day doesn't even recognize that anything out of the ordinary happened on that day in Roswell in 1947. But at Stefan's encounter site, they retrieved his burnt glove and shirt. There was a circle about 15 feet in diameter that was completely devoid of moss and vegetation, perhaps where the aircraft landed. There were soil samples and samples of Stefan's clothing that were tested, and they all came back as being highly radioactive. There was also metal melted into the cracks of the rocks that was found a year later and was also highly radioactive. So it seems like whatever the blast was, the ongoing symptoms of Stefan were at least caused by radiation poisoning. After being admitted to a hospital, Stefan was then sent to a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist came back and said that Stefan was a fellow who is very pragmatic, very down to earth, if you'll excuse the pun, and does not make up stories. Stefan's son, Stan, author of a book that actually covers this encounter, later said that if my dad did hoax this, remember we're talking about a blue-collar industrial mechanic, if he did hoax it, then he was an absolute genius. And I personally absolutely agree, which is why for me this is the best UFO encounter ever documented. Like, ever. Giant scuttles are these unknown, huge, giant squid-like creatures spotted in the Bahamas and the Caribbean. They roam out deep down in open waters and are said to attack ships and boats by getting one tentacle underneath the hull and another tentacle on top of the hull, and then wrapping them together and forming some sort of a grip, and then sinking or destroying the ship. Pretty scary way to go. Death by scuttle. One of these has never been captured, but they are said to be the real creatures behind the legendary Kraken. Scary stuff. If you are enjoying this video, I do weekly videos exploring dark, mysterious, fascinating, and interesting things. So if that sounds like your cup of tea, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you do not miss any new videos that I put out. Tip the like button if you are liking it so far, and let me know what you are drinking in the comments below. But let's get back to the video. Gibby was a cancelled spin-off of iCarly for Nickelodeon. Gibby was this minor recurring character in iCarly who was a bit of a weirdo, a bit of a dork, and he was set to receive a spin-off series in which he was just a massive goofball, I guess. The pilot script is basically Gibby getting sentenced to detention after his pet weasel bites his teacher on the butt. Yep, that's a good plotline. Then he works out a deal with the principal to work in the cafeteria instead of going to detention. He then saves a bunch of kids from bullies, goes to hang out in this recreational center, and gets taken hostage by a bunch of burglars. The end. This and another spin-off of iCarly, Sam and Cat, were both proposed, both had pilots made, but 2 pilots enter, 1 pilot leaves, and Gibby sadly didn't make the cut, and so was never renewed past its pilot episode. And maybe that's for the best. The Gil Family. In 2002 Argentina, 6 members of the Gil family vanished into seemingly thin air without a trace. This was one of the more mysterious disappearances that has happened in recent years, and what exactly happened to the family still hasn't been uncovered over 20 years later. The whole family lived basically on a large ranch in, obviously, Argentina. They worked as landlords and basically took care of the ranch as a whole, doing a bunch of the minor jobs as well. And the owner of the ranch was a man named Alfonso Goyete, but we'll get into him a little bit later. On the night of January 12th, 2002, the whole family went to a nearby town to visit a friend, and this was the last time that the family was ever seen. 3 months later, in April, Goyete reported to the relatives of the Gils, and then they later reported to the police that the Gils hadn't returned from their 3-month vacation that Goyete had given them, which, can I just say, it sounds like a long-ass vacation to give. And so, after being reported missing, the search began. But it wasn't very easy or eventful, as there were no bodies, no real evidence of any kind, and it had been 3 months since they went missing, so the case was very cold. Ruben, the father, had apparently made phone calls to a woman in Rosario, Argentina, just after they went missing, but police were unable to trace these calls. And a neighbor said that they had seen one of the family members maybe riding on a horse shortly after they went missing, and that was kind of it. So yeah, not much evidence at all to go off. After years of investigation and coming up with nothing, the ranch was eventually raided. The floors were raised up, the wells were dug out, and the ranch was monitored with an echo sounder, which basically shoots echoes out through the ground to try and find holes in the soil, or disturbed soil. Disturbed as in moved, not disturbed as in haunted. As if it's been moved and there's holes around, maybe that indicates a grave of some sort. But there were no potential grave sites found, and the only blood found on the ranch didn't belong to the Gils, though forensics say that over time the blood work may not be as reliable as they wanted to be. There were psychologists brought in to do analyses essentially of the family, and they determined that they likely didn't run away or do anything more drastic to themselves, as the whole family seemed to be fairly well grounded and happy, at least mentally. But neighbors did say that the normally happy, very talkative Ruben, the father of the family, was oddly quiet and concerned just days before the disappearance. So, did Ruben have some knowledge of what was going to happen, or was he just concerned about something else that may or may not be related to the disappearance? Over the years, the case has been opened and reopened various times. Multiple searches and investigations have been conducted, but nothing new has been uncovered, and none of the Gils have appeared in any work, home, or migration documents. So, pretty strange. Now, one thing I have to cover is the ranch's owner, Alfonso Goyete. Right at the very start of the investigation, he hinted that the family might have gone to live with relatives in Santa Fe, or might have migrated north in search of work, which to me is a bit of a weird stretch to say that they would do either of these things really without telling Goyete, as their entire livelihood seemed to be on this ranch. And he claimed that the family had left all of their possessions on the ranch, including money and personal documents, and when relatives came to the house to check, they didn't find money, they didn't find documents, they just found the rooms empty with the mattresses being burnt, which is somewhat very suspicious. And lastly, the fact that Goyete had given them 3 months vacation, when prior to this, the longest he had ever given them was just a week or two. So the more I read into this case, the more suspicious I get of Goyete. But unfortunately, we won't get any more information or a confession out of him, as he died in a car crash in 2016 at the age of 78. But whatever happened to the Gils, I hope they are at peace and happy, whether that's in this life or the next. The Graves of Old Swan was this creepy, weird, insane case where in the 1970s there were plans to demolish an old school from the 1800s. This was in Old Swan, Liverpool, and in its place they were to build 2 new state-of-the-art schools. So the checks went through, the plans were made, and the demolition was started. But what they then found completely stopped everyone and everything. During the building of one of the new schools, they discovered over 3,500 graves. This was obviously a shocking discovery, and some clever people from the internet have tried to basically map out where these graves might have come from. So here are the sites of the 2 new schools in our modern Google Earth times, and here is the 1830s map of the area overlaid. And as you can see, or maybe can't see, it's a little hard to make out, but there are no graves or burial grounds. But when we take this map, which is technically undated but is likely from between 1906 and 1956, we see the area clearly marked as burial ground. So it seems that sometime between when the map was made and when the school was set to be demolished, there was some lack of research done, some miscommunication, that ended up with this disused burial ground being uncovered. There are some conspiracy theories about this incident, saying that this was a mass grave that was related either to the Irish potato famine, as it was in Liverpool a common place of relocation for the Irish after the famine, or it was some kind of mass killing of people that took place in the 1800s. It was also thought that maybe these were plague pits, which were mass graves to put plague victims into, but that theory doesn't make tons of sense considering how close this is to the center of town, and it's not very smart to put loads of highly infectious plague victims in a high traffic area at the center of town. And people also thought that it was strange that large screens were put up as they were exhuming the graves to block any sight whatsoever of them. People suggested that maybe they were blocking off the bodies because maybe the people were killed in strange ways, or because the bodies perhaps weren't even human. But from what I could find, these screens seem to be fairly standard protocol when dealing with bodies and graves out in the public like this. So this was a pretty shocking case, especially I'd say for the builders who dug up and uncovered this. And will we ever get a definitive answer on where the bodies and graves came from? Probably not, but it's definitely a case to think about. The Great Sheep Panic was an event that happened on the 3rd of November in 1888. This was across southern England, where tens of thousands of sheep all fled their fields across a 200-mile area of Oxfordshire. This was around 8 o'clock in the evening, and all of these sheep, simultaneously apparently, broke out of their bonds and fled the fields and confinements that they were kept in. And most of them were found the next morning, scattered throughout fields, hedges, roads. It was sheep mayhem, and I don't use that term lightly. The papers reported that malicious mischief was out of the question, as 1,000 men, they said, could not have frightened all of these sheep. So I guess it was aliens? Ghosts? Or perhaps it was, as noted in the Scientific Journal of Nature, that on that night it had been especially dark, and occasional flashes of lightning lit up the night sky. So perhaps it was lightning that scared these sheep silly. Maybe. I'm still gonna stick with aliens though. And really quick guys, I would just like to thank my Patreon supporters, Kelly Scott, Ash M, Foxy Nico, and Paper Shades. Every bit of support from you guys means the world to me, and if you'd like to tip a tea or coffee or see these videos a few days early, there are links to that and the Patreon in the description below. Once again, massive thank you to all who support the channel, but let's get back to the video. The Grinch of Gloucester, or Gloucester, or Gloucester? This was a kind of strange, kind of wholesome sighting of a man caught on CCTV dressed up as the Grinch, leaving presents for kids in various houses around Christmas time. He scared a few kids in the neighborhood and actually left gifts for one girl for her birthday outside of her house. He wrote in the letter, maybe Christmas, he thought, doesn't come from a store. Maybe Christmas, perhaps, means a little bit more, which is just a great line from a great story. He left her flowers and chocolates, and as this was in the years that we don't speak about, said that he ensured that everything was quarantined for 3 days. Now, I'm sure he communicated in some way to the parents beforehand, as they seemed to love it as well and weren't creeped out by a man leaving their teenage daughter presents. And after this, the whole neighborhood was left wondering if the kind Grinch would leave them presents this year. Hamster wheel broadcast interference. So this was a strange reported incident by a Redditor who said that in the early 2000s he witnessed something very eerie and creepy on TV and years later couldn't find any evidence of it. He said he turned on the TV to Nickelodeon and saw a creepy black and white scene where hundreds of nude people were walking all around and in a line towards these hills in the background. And at these hills there were these giant hamster wheels that were filled with a bunch of people walking inside of them, with a bunch more people either walking towards them or walking around them. He said he watched this scene in awe on loop for he doesn't know how long, and then eventually just changed the channel. Then he thought, what the fuck did I just watch? And why was it on Nickelodeon? So he changed the channel back, only to find it halfway through an episode of SpongeBob. He flicked around channels for a while trying to find it, but never could. Nobody on the Reddit post was able to help him out or give him really any clues, so this is a strange case that has never been solved. Pretty odd. The Humpty Dumpty Circus is this strange stop-motion short created in 1908 that sadly has been lost to the sands of time. This short film is widely believed to be the first ever example of a stop-motion film and was made using a Humpty Dumpty circus toy set that belonged to the producer's daughter. There's not much to go off on this case besides the fact that some people thought that it was made later than 1908, perhaps making it not the first ever stop-motion film, and Smith, the producer, claimed that it was made years earlier than 1908, likely in an effort to make this even more ahead of its time than it actually was. But it was likely a cool little creative film nonetheless. The Jaguar F1 Diamond. So this story honestly sounds like more fiction than fact, but it is absolutely true. In 2004 at the Monaco F1 Grand Prix, Jaguar, one of the racing teams, had a sponsorship deal with an upcoming film, Ocean's 12, which if you haven't seen it is a movie about a heist. Great film, honestly. But as part of this sponsorship deal, believe it or not, Jaguar had two massive $400,000 diamonds embedded into the front of their two race cars, which to me is such a strange, unusual, ballsy marketing decision. But hey, you do you, Jaguar. Webber, one of the drivers, made it through the entire race unscathed with the diamond intact. Good job, Webber. But the other driver, Klein, unfortunately crashed head-on right into one of the barriers. He was fine, thankfully, but the car was just obliterated. And the diamond was somewhere. The diamond was strangely not even insured, and Jaguar team officials weren't even allowed onto the track until 2 hours after the race had finished, due to safety regulations, by which point the diamond was nowhere to be seen. So it was either picked up by a lucky and somewhat dishonest, and I don't blame them honestly, racetrack worker, or it was embedded deep into a wall or barrier of some kind, and was claimed and pecked out by a lucky seagull at a landfill or something. Either way, Jaguar never recovered the second diamond, and I think probably that serves them right for sticking a $400,000 diamond onto the front of a Formula 1 car. And that is all we have time for. Make sure you stay warm in these coming winter months, maybe wear an extra pair of socks or something, and as always, thanks for watching.